All right, I think we're ready to go. Good morning, everybody. There's a lot of people today, but we're not missing you. You're here, and that's what matters. All right, let's jump into this. Today, we're going to continue the endocrine system, picking up where we left off on Monday. And you'll see in the title slide here, photograph. I actually don't know when this was taken, sometime in the past 10, 15 years or so. But this is actually, at least on record, the world's tallest man and the world's shortest man. And you can see the dramatic difference there, and the large kind of, I would say, primary reason for that difference in size is due to growth hormone and variation in the levels of growth hormone between these two individuals. And so I just wanted to start off with this to kind of show you some of the dramatic effects that hormones can have in your body. Now, obviously, this is an extreme example, but this is one example of the way this hormonal regulation affects all kind of different aspects of your development, your growth, and your well-being. So to continue on that idea, our agenda for today looks like this. I've got a human anatomy in the news for you to start with, which I'm excited to share with you about. And we're going to continue the endocrine system. We actually will get to Andre the Giant and Missy Elliott today for reals. And we're going to do some review drawings and a little discussion activity in there as well. Then we'll end class today. I want to give back quiz number 5 and also just give you some reminders, and we have a ticket out today. So before we jump into all of that, what questions do you have? Well, so after today, we only have 3 lectures left for this class. It's kind of crazy. Yeah. We're good? All right, human anatomy news. So the question came up last class about the thymus and like why it ages and where you get your T cells when you're old. Thought this is a really good question. I didn't have a good answer, so I dived in a little bit to find out an answer for you. So the aging thymus, just to review, the thymus is an organ that's important for both endocrine and immune function. Remember, it's the site of lymphocyte maturation, specifically where lymphocytes mature into T lymphocytes, and also produces hormones that help kind of regulate this development of immune cells. And I just said that. But as I said, this thymus shrinks with age. And this, what happens is this essentially leads to reduced capacity to mature these lymphocytes in old age. And I found this from a paper. You can see kind of the size roughly of the thymus in a newborn, and you can see how it gets smaller as you age. Now, one caveat I want to put in here is I found research that said that the thymus was largest at birth and just gradually got smaller. But I found some other research that said it actually gets a little bit bigger during puberty and then gradually decreases with age through adulthood. So I don't know if it starts off as big as it's ever going to get and then just shrinks from there, or if it actually does get a little bigger during puberty. Maybe that varies among individuals even. But the larger takeaway message is that, as you can see, as you get older in adulthood, essentially your thymus, what happens is the thymus itself shrinks, but also a lot of the active endocrine tissue is replaced by fat tissue. And so by the time you're this age, you have these smatterings of these active tissue sites, but most of it is just fatty tissue. Now, this process where this active tissue is replaced by fatty tissue is known as thymus involution. And researchers recently discovered that a type of cell called the stomal cell found in the thymus actually differentiates into this adipose tissue, this fatty tissue, but doesn't have the ability to differentiate into this active immune tissue. And so this is a study that came out just a couple years ago, and you can see the diagram here. You don't need to worry about all the details. The gist of it is that these cells in the thymus have different developmental capacities. And they found this one specific kind of cell that only can develop into adipose tissue. So the thought is that if somehow you could regulate the amount of those cells, maybe reduce the number or reduce their development, then you can promote the activity of the cells that can differentiate into active immune cells. And the researchers kind of framed, or at least the press article kind of framed this as like turning back the clock on aging. So one of the major drawbacks of aging, and there are many, I can attest to that. There's also good things too. I don't want to sound all negative. Are there? Yeah, I'm sure there are some. Yeah, I'll get back to you on that one. But the idea, so much of human research is around this idea of how do we prevent or slow the effects of aging? Because there's a lot of aspects of aging that aren't great. And one of those is your reduced immune capacity. And part of the reason for that is this change in the structure and the function of the thymus over the time. So researchers were excited to be able to understand this process in more detail with the thought that maybe somehow it could be regulated and you could keep that thymus active into later adulthood so that you continue producing these T cells and continue having this stronger immune response. So I have links to the popular press article. It'll take you 3 minutes to read, as well as the original article, which you don't have to read. It's just there for your reference. But that is in your program for Friday. I'll kind of just stick with what we've done so far this semester, and you can expect a multiple choice question about that on your lecture exam, the last exam. I don't think I've included any of these actually in quizzes. So we'll just stick with that and have an exam question for you. Questions, thoughts, comments? I wish there was an easy way to measure the mass of all of our thymuses. Is that the plural? I think that's the plural. And kind of compare across the class. It'd be really easy. You guys would all be up here and 5% of my thymus left. I'll come back to you on good effects of aging. All right, great. So we left off talking about the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis or hypophysis. This is a little bit of a reminder. We covered this already, just where this sits. I'm not going to walk through this because you've seen this. You've seen these structures a bunch of time now in both our brain section and the anatomy section. What is really important, though, and this is an important takeaway, is that the pituitary is actually split into two. There's the anterior pituitary in the front, not surprisingly, and in the back we have this part of the pituitary. Yes, this is the anterior in the front. This is part of the pituitary in the back. Posterior pituitary, boom. Now, the pituitary is kind of lumped together as we just call it the pituitary gland. But what's really important is that these are two very different structures, both anatomically and functionally. And I want to get into a little bit of the detail there. Sorry, this cord is tripping me. The important thing to take away is that the anterior pituitary actually is a true endocrine gland. It produces and secretes hormones. The posterior pituitary actually technically isn't an endocrine gland. It stores hormones that are made in the hypothalamus, and they travel down the bloodstream here, and they hang out in the posterior pituitary and then are released, but they're not actually made in the posterior pituitary. There's also neurons that travel through this infundibulum between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary is more of a nervous system structure and more of a kind of endocrine or a hormone repository where those hormones can hang out and be ready to circulate when they receive the signal. Now, I have a bunch of abbreviations of different hormones here for you. Don't worry about that just yet. I wanted to show you the structure on the slide. I'll talk about those. There's a bunch of abbreviations there that probably don't mean a lot to you right now. So if we look at the structure in a little more detail, we can see something that looks like this. I want to walk through some of the physiology here, but I'm not going to focus on the actual physiology. I'm going to focus on more of the anatomical structures. And to start, we have the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is nervous tissue. It's part of the brain, but it also produces hormones. It's also endocrine tissue. And the hormones that are produced here are released into what's called the hypophyseal portal system. So this is these blood vessels that travel between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary down the infundibulum. And you can see here we have this capillary plexus here. So plexus just refers to a group of small blood vessels. Then we have the vein that's bringing the hormones down here. And then we have the plexus in the anterior pituitary so that the hormones from the hypothalamus can be diffused throughout that anterior pituitary. And let's walk through this. Actually, I got ahead of myself a little bit. Let me walk through this. I have some more details here. What's interesting is that the hormones in the hypothalamus are actually produced by these neurons, these hypothalamic neurons. And they produce hormones that are either categorized as releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. And they do exactly what their name would imply. Releasing hormones tell the anterior pituitary to release more hormones, and inhibiting hormones tell the anterior pituitary to stop releasing hormones. And so you can think of this as like a two-layered control system. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary what to do, then the pituitary tells the rest of the body what to do, more or less. There's a little bit more to it in some cases, but that's generally the gist. So those hormones travel down these portal veins through the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary, where they travel through this plexus of capillaries. That way the hormones can diffuse across the blood barrier and interact with the endocrine tissue in the anterior pituitary. And like I said, either tell that tissue to release more of the hormones it's going to release or to release less of them. Those hormones then go into general circulation, which means that they then travel in the bloodstream throughout the body where they can interact with the target tissue. Just going to pause there and let you get those down. I have one more note for you. Actually, let me add the last note and then I'll pause so you have all of it at once. These hormones released from the anterior pituitary include all of these heaps you see here. So I'm not going to get into the details of the hormones between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, although I want you to know that those are different. We have one set of hormones going just from here to here, very limited pathway, right? Then we have a whole another suite of hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary to the rest of the body. And these include growth hormone, prolactin, melanin stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. All of those guys are released there. Let me just turn this sound off here. Sorry about that. I'm going to talk briefly about some of these hormones. You don't need to know all of them. We get into this in a little more detail in 251. And those of you that have taken physiology 325, I'm sure. Who's taken 325 with Dr. Pennis? You get into these pathways in a lot more detail, right? Yep. What I want to focus on today is just the general anatomical structures. But I do want you to know that there's a whole bunch of different hormones that do a whole bunch of different things that are regulated by this anterior pituitary. So just to rehash the important takeaway messages, hypothalamus is nervous tissue. Those neurons secrete hormones into the bloodstream of the hypothalamus that are picked up in this primary capillary plexus. Those hormones travel in the bloodstream through these veins, these portal veins, to the anterior pituitary, where those hormones interact with the endocrine tissue in the anterior pituitary that regulates all of these different hormones. So note that the communication in this case between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is and it's hormonal communication. And note that the anterior pituitary is a true endocrine gland in that it produces hormones and then releases those hormones into the bloodstream. And you'll see why this is important because that's in contrast to your posterior pituitary. Questions? Cool. All right, so I want to now transition and talk about the posterior pituitary. What happens here is that the posterior pituitary is part nervous tissue. And you can see that neurons travel from the hypothalamus. Those neurons travel down the infundibulum, and they have their axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. So in this case, we have communication between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. But that communication is not hormonal. In this case, it's via these nerves. So you can imagine it's faster because signals down neurons travel faster than hormonal signals. Although in this case, this is a pretty short distance, so it doesn't really matter that much. Now, there's two specific nuclei in the hypothalamus I've highlighted here, the paraventricular nucleus, which is responsible for regulating ADH, and then the supraoptic nucleus, which regulates oxytocin, or produces, I should say, not regulates. Well, it regulates and produces those. When we talked about the hypothalamus, I showed you the one diagram that had a bunch of nuclei. I said you don't need to worry about exactly those details. You don't need to worry about it here. I do want you to know that there are certain areas in the hypothalamus that are producing these different hormones, and then those hormones are produced in these cells and actually travel in the cell here, and then are released in the posterior pituitary. Let's see, that's all I want to say there. Let me just walk through this a little bit. So we have these hypothalamic neurons that are synthesizing one of these two hormones, oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is kind of known as the, I'll talk about this a little more, but it's kind of known as the affection hormone. So it's important, for example, when moms are breastfeeding newborns, or not necessarily newborns, breastfeeding infants, it's a hormone that kind of regulates your like affection and empathy for others. Among other things. And antidiuretic hormone is important for regulating your water balance. And so it controls how much you pee, basically. So those are produced in the hypothalamus. They travel down the neuron, and they end up in the posterior pituitary. Then they're stored there in what's called these neurosecretory bodies. So they're made up in the hypothalamus, and then they're kept for storage in the posterior pituitary until they receive another nervous system signal that basically tells these neurosecretory bodies to release oxytocin or ADH into the bloodstream. So note that there's only two hormones associated with the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and ADH, and there's 7 of them I think I had listed for the anterior pituitary. So it's noteworthy here that the posterior lobe of the pituitary is not making these hormones, it's storing those hormones that are released from the hypothalamus and then releasing them. So you can almost think of this more as a part of the brain rather than separate entities. Just had an idea for something I want to do in class on Friday. So I'm just giving myself a nope. No questions? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of these hormones. I'm going to give you like a real kind of whirlwind tour. This is actually taken from your textbook. So you have reference to this in the text and the readings associated with this lecture. I want to walk through just some of the hormones and their target organs. So remember, just as a refresher, that those hormones are put into general circulation in the blood. And so essentially they come into contact with all of the tissues in your body, all of the tissues that are vascularized anyway. So for example, cartilage wouldn't be receiving these hormones because it's not vascularized, but basically everything else in your body is more or less. And so these hormones are coming into contact with all of these different tissues, but only certain tissues have the receptors to actually receive that message. And so what I want to talk about here is specific hormones and then their target tissue. And so one example is the thyroid stimulating hormone, which not surprisingly, the target tissue is your thyroid, which basically tells your thyroid to release the different hormones that it produces. And this helps regulate your kind of energy balance generally. So how much fuel your body uses, and it can affect things like weight loss and weight gain and kind of the energy available to all of your cells. We then have something called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. That is then the target tissue for that is the adrenal cortex of your adrenal glands. So the outside of your adrenal gland, here, these are the glands that sit on top of your kidneys. And those glands in turn produce things like glucocorticoids, which is probably a hormone that you've heard a lot about. For example, cortisol is commonly called like the stress hormone in humans. It's actually a lot more complicated than that, but in general, it does play an important role in the stress response. And also mineralocorticoids, which regulate water and energy balance kind of more generally. I don't need you to know what cells in the pituitary produce these different hormones. I do want you to know the names of some of the hormones and their target tissues generally. So no thyroid stimulating hormone affects the thyroid, adrenocorticotropic hormone affects the adrenal glands, which is not surprising. We also have follicle stimulating hormone with the target tissue for that is your ovaries and testes. So this plays an important role in follicle maturation. So early development of into eggs, as well as sperm production in males. And also luteinizing hormone, which again, the target tissue are the gonads, and in females, this triggers ovulation and stimulates production of estrogen and progesterone. So you have this like continuing cycle of hormones. One hormone triggers another. And in males, this promotes testosterone production. Now, I'm using the term males and females here in a general sense. Of course, there's lots of variation between there. I don't want to, especially when it comes to the endocrine system, I don't want to present things as completely dichotomous. There's one or the other. There's a lot of variation in how these systems function generally. A little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to cover. We're just kind of talking about the general anatomical structures, but just know that sex is a lot more complicated than just male and female. And of course, I mean that anatomically, but also physiologically, not to mention sociologically. Yeah, Jada.
Birth control is messing with those two hormonal birth control?
That's exactly what it is. Gosh, I've known this well at some points. I can't pull it off the top of my head, but basically what it does is it triggers a hormonal pathway. So basically your body thinks that you're already pregnant, and so then it doesn't initiate this cycle of follicle maturation and ovulation. Good question, Jade. And I wish your textbook gets in a little more detail. I just don't have that on the top of my head. Yep. Couple more for you. We've got growth hormone. So not surprisingly, the growth hormone targets a lot of tissues in your body that are important for growth. So things like your long bones and your skeletal muscle, you think during development, you're just getting bigger and all of those tissues are expanding in size. Also your liver, which is an important site of where energy important molecules are stored and processed and things like that. For example, glycogen and whatnot. And so growth hormone affects all that. And then prolactin is produced in the anterior pituitary as well, and that promotes lactation. And that's the general overview of those anterior pituitary hormones. I got a couple more for posterior pituitary. And that is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So remember, just as a refresher, these hormones are not produced in the anterior or posterior pituitary. They're produced in the hypothalamus, but stored there until the signal to release them is received, and then they release these hormones into the bloodstream. ADH stimulates the kidney tubule cells to reabsorb water. So as ADH increases, you will pee less, basically. And so that affects your water balance, obviously. And then we have oxytocin, which, as I mentioned, is important for, is generally thought of as the affection hormone, kind of loosely, but specifically plays a role during childbirth. It stimulates the uterine contractions and initiates labor, and then plays an important role in breastfeeding. I was working on this lecture. My daughter she plays bass, and I took her to bass lessons the other day, and I was it's like half an hour. So there's like some seats, and I was kind of hanging out, and I was just putting some of the slides together for this lecture. And the seats are kind of set up as if like it's like for an audience. So I'm like kind of in the front, and there's like other parents and stuff behind me. And is a good example of like how what I do just seems completely normal to me. But I was putting together the slides, and there's like a bunch of slides of like naked people and genitals and things like this in the slides. And I'm just like, making human anatomy lecture. And I realized there's like a bunch of parents sitting behind me. And I have my like laptop with all these pictures of half naked people. And I was a little worried about what their impression might be if they didn't know the context of like, it's really weird. This guy's like waiting for his daughter to be out of bass lessons, and he's looking at PowerPoint slides of, yeah, anyway, probably need to be more thoughtful about that. But like, it's one of those things where like, it just doesn't occur to me. I'm not like, this is weird that I have pictures of naked people, because it's just like slides for anatomy class. Like, it's not anything weird. Anyway, with that in mind, I want to do a quick activity here, and I want you to get you just thinking about these hormones a little bit generally. So the idea here is a quick think, pair, share. Actually, I want you to work individually first, and then we're going to go and be in groups of 2 or 3. So I want you to just pick any of the hormones released by the anterior pituitary. So let's focus on the anterior pituitary for now. Actually, you know what? If you want to do posterior pituitary, if you're like, man, I really want to do oxytocin, go for it. And I want you to think about what pathology would be caused if you overproduce this hormone and if you underproduce this hormone. Just think about what might the end result be. And so take 2 minutes and do that, jot down some notes, and then we're going to get with a partner and kind of debrief what you think about it. If you get to the point where you've kind of exhausted your imagination and want to do a quick search and see, that's fine as well. Well, I didn't put this on the slide, but I'm going to mark this down as a class activity for you too. So you'll get the associated points. Time is okay. Sarah, and Sophie, Taryn, just Matt, Julia, Travis, Zoe. All right, go ahead and grab a partner or 2, no more than 3 in a group, please, and just kind of share with them what you just wrote about, and then hear what they have to say. This would be a group.
Have enough, then like obviously. I thought the growth hormone, so if you have like something like overgrowth, so your body might not be able to like keep up with the rate. You don't have enough stem growth in the bodies like that. So it's really that, so it's not the bodies. And I have on this foot that it's overgrowth and your bones. And then there's under production of the I always feel what she said. It's right in the radio. I was looking at it, that's what I know. But yeah. Is it cortisol and cortisone? Is that divided by a shirt test? And I got like to see what it's all. The first question, I looked for like an hour, like I was supposed to get the question one second, I literally pulled it out, so it's why her. Like I did my own math problems programming and I was like, I really don't know where this is. Could not figure out where, and I wrote so much. This is the final exam, but I just remember the test. That's what it was. So it does this form. That's not like great. It's good. I'm figuring
all right, let's bring it back together. What group wants to volunteer and talk about, let's just pull a couple examples to talk about generally. And we're not going to get into this in detail. My point in doing this activity is just to get you thinking about the effects of how these hormones can affect the long-term effects of variation in these hormones. And what I want to note is I asked you to think about what happens if you produce too much or too little of a hormone. You can also have effects if there's too many or too few receptors for the hormone on the target tissue. So just keep that in mind as we're thinking about this. So anybody want to volunteer? Awesome, Jada, thank you.
I said, in my group, I chose prolactin.
Mhm.
And I said, if you have too much, then your boobs will like be swollen and leak milk. I said, if you don't have enough, then your baby will die because you can't produce milk. Yeah,
that could be it. Yep. And in generally in today's world, hopefully the baby won't die. There's formula and things like that, right? But back in the day, that wasn't an option. Although back in the day, people lived in more kind of like communal groups, and like the different a lot of different moms would breastfeed different babies. Like it wasn't just your baby. They had a different kind of culture on that, which is interesting to think about. Like, because back in the day, if that happened to a mom if prolactin was low, the baby would die if someone else wasn't there. But people, like, it wasn't as individualized as it is today. But yeah, that's exactly right. Good job, David. Thank you. Other thoughts, other examples? Give me one more, Gia. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Yep. So the overproduction of ACTH in the anterior pituitary will stimulate the adrenal cortex to overproduce cortisol, which has a lot of effects. And what it actually has a specific, there's something called Cushing's syndrome, where people overproduce it. And what happens, it changes your energy balance. You can be very like low energy and fatigued. It also changes, interestingly, the way fat is deposited throughout your body. And so instead of depositing fat generally in your like limbs and even your abdomen, you get a fatty deposit like in your back, kind of right here, and you can kind of get like almost like a hump. And also it produces something that's commonly called moon face, which is a little it's kind of derogatory, but like where you have extra fatty tissue around your face as well. So you have like this kind of rounded face with extra fatty tissue. So it has a specific suite of characteristics. And actually, no, more fat is deposited on the back and on the abdomen. Let me get this right, in the center of the body, but there's very little in the arms and legs. So you have kind of like a big abdomen and center of your body, but like your legs and arms are kind of skinny. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Yep. Good. Couple examples of people that you might know. I want to give the example of gigantism. which is the overproduction of growth hormone early in development. And so we all know and love Andre the Giant. You should go watch Princess Bride tomorrow and then watch it again every day after that. So a great example. And what's interesting about this, I don't want to get into too much detail, but you can see kind of how his facial structure changed over time. So part of the result of this overproduction of growth hormone is that actually different parts of the body grow a little bit differently. And specifically, often the hands and the face kind of continue growing even beyond the rest of the body. So people tend to have like a very large face and often very large hands, and of course, very large overall, as Andre the Giant lived up to his name. Another example of the effects of this is Missy Elliott. So, objectively speaking, the greatest hip hop artist of all time. She suffered from hypothyroidism, where her thyroid gland wasn't working properly, and that leads to a lot of trouble with maintaining good energy balance. And so by that, I mean, you'll have days when you're kind of hyperactive and days when you can be really, really like lethargic. It can also lead to really rapid weight loss and gain and things like that. And she's struggled with this. So she actually talked about this a little bit publicly. I'm sure you know, as well as I do, she hasn't released a full-length album since The Cookbook, which came out in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, which is way too long ago. But a lot of the reason for their kind of hiatus from touring and from producing music has been suffering from this chronic disease, which sucks. But, you know, she did Super Bowl appearance and all that stuff in the meantime. So she's still around. She's still the queen. All right. Questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? All right. Let's see. We got time. Let's talk about the pineal gland a little bit. And then I've got just a quick review drawing and some wrap up. I think we'll have time for all of that. We should be good. So the pineal gland, as you might remember, is associated with the epithalamus back here. I'm not going to walk through all of this diagram. It should be very familiar to you at this point. Just wanted to place the pineal gland in its position there in the epithalamus. The pineal gland is a very small little gland. It's kind of pine cone shaped, and it is on the roof of the diencephalon, specifically in the epithalamus, and it contains these special cells called pinealocytes that are arranged in these kind of special structures. We don't need to worry about that too much. I just want you to know the names of those cells, and that these cells produce the hormone melatonin. So melatonin is really important for regulating our sleep-wake cycle. It's released when it's dark out, and it helps regulate your circadian rhythms. And interestingly, suppresses gonads. So I think I mentioned this earlier in class. Your sex drive is actually decreased as melatonin increases, which often happens, which happens with the daily cycle of night and dark. Now, in our modern world, we throw this totally out of whack because we're exposed to a lot of artificial light throughout the day, even when it's nighttime, and that's part of the reason why we have so many struggles. Often folks have struggles with sleeping and sleeping regularly and falling asleep and that kind of thing. Because of that exposure to light, then if you're exposed to this light, your pineal gland is not producing enough melatonin, and then your body is not getting into this regular circadian rhythm. The way this gland is structured, I don't need to know about this too much, but it's just kind of interesting, is that there's these kind of particles that are heavy in calcium, like this kind of calcified particle called pineal sand. And when you look at this in an X-ray, it's opaque. So unlike most of the soft tissue in the brain, you can actually pick out the pineal gland. I don't know why I don't have an example of this on here, but you can see where the pineal gland is in an X-ray, and then that can be used as a landmark to figure out where other stuff is. So the takeaway message here, pineal gland in the epithalamus, and it is primarily it produces the hormone melatonin, and it is involved with sleep cycle. So for each of these hormones, I'm going to put a big banner on the slide that wants you to associate pineal gland, sleep cycle, circadian rhythm more generally, but let's just think of it as your sleep cycle. All right, I want to just skip ahead to a quick review activity here at the end of our class. I guess I could start off the next class with this too. No, let's just go ahead and do it now. go ahead and take 2 minutes. And I want you to draw this diagram. So it's similar to what we did the other day with immune tissue. And I want you just to label those structures that are not labeled on here. Do as best you can from memory. I have the next slide will show you what the answers are, but see how much of this you can pull out just by way of review. See, a lot of people still drawing. I'll give you another minute. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the answers. So this is just by way of a refresher. You can test your knowledge and see which ones of those you know. The ones you don't know, be sure to go back and review. Now, I know we haven't talked about all of them in detail, but I do want you to make sure you know where these structures are and what they look like. You can expect a diagram like this for sure on your quiz, which is next Monday, where you're just going to be labeling these different endocrine structures. Gia, go ahead. Great question. So I'm going to start off the next lecture. The next one we're going to talk about is the thyroid and parathyroid. But basically, the thyroid is this gland right here. The parathyroid glands are these little guys kind of embedded in the thyroid. And we'll get to that on Friday. That's a good question. Thank you. Any other questions on this? All right, we will finish up the endocrine system on Friday. That should actually be perfect timing. I'm going to skip ahead to a couple other things here. Just a reminder in giant letters to do your course evaluations. You will get, did you get emails for course evaluations yet? You will. In this class I listed to be evaluated, and I really need you guys to respond and do those evaluations. They're super helpful for me. Like I read through them very carefully. And also they go into like my permanent file, and I'm going up for tenure next year and all that. So do me good. And I'm not saying give me good evaluations. Give me honest evaluations. But do me a solid and complete the evaluation in whatever form that takes. I appreciate it. With that in mind, I want to give back quiz number 5. I am going to give these back. I do have one student in the class who hasn't taken it yet, so don't share this information yet, but I want you to have these back in hand so you can use them as you prepare for the lecture exam. Out of 30 points, the class average was a 77, which is actually just about on par with other in-class closed book quizzes. You can see the distribution here. A couple of you rocked it. Like, look at all these scores, close to 30 here. Awesome, awesome work. A lot of people kind of right in the middle. A few of you kind of down here. Again, we do have one more in-class quiz if you're scoring on that end of things. Be sure you think about how you're preparing for that. I'm going to hand these back to you right now as you complete your ticket out. But before you do, actually, I don't want you to scan that QR code. Hold on the QR code yet. Let me just give a couple announcements. I know you really want to do this ticket out. Remember, quiz 6 is on Monday. Details are in your class program. Also, in your class program for Friday are details for your lab practical. I provided a guide, a study guide for the lab practical yesterday in lab. It's available in Visible Body. Specifically looking here, I split the class, I randomized your names, split the class in two. Half of the class is going to take that lab practical at 8:30, half is going to take it at 10 o'clock. So be sure to see there and know what time you're going, and let me know if you have questions about that. Otherwise, Danny still has his tutoring sessions, including one tomorrow, and you've got your ticket out for today. While you're doing that, I'll give back your quizzes. If you have any other questions, just keep me posted.
You're supposed to give those back to me, right?
The quizzes? No, you can keep it. Just keep it secret.